If you like knights, samurai, romance, weapons and armor, become a noble one. Subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. Hey noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. Weapons have many types and subcategories, but probably one of the most obvious ones is the division between melee weapons, used in hand-to-hand, and ranged weapons, used instead at distance. Obviously, this line of division is not absolute. At the end of the day, any melee weapon can be thrown if the situation demands it. To be fair, anything can be thrown, literally. And any ranged weapon can be smashed onto someone's head. But of course, that's not how they were designed and optimized to be operated. At number 10, we've got the throwing stick. Lots of different versions. One I'd like to have a look at is the rungu from Africa, associated with the Maasai warriors. Now, this one specifically looks quite nasty, particularly because of its sort of swollen business end. I would not want to be hit with that in the head. I can really imagine the sound of cracking of the skull. Oh my gosh, it's disgusting. This one specifically was used both in warfare and for hunting. But I think the overall idea of, look, there's a Muppet who wants to take my land, I'll throw this wooden stick on his head, serves him well. I think this idea probably goes all the way back to prehistorical times. I mean, to the frigging Stone Age prehistorical times. Number 9, the throwing axe. Okay, I think we're all familiar with the axe. We see it all over the place. It's a weapon that is normally in pop culture associated with barbarians or Vikings, but at the end of the day, it is a weapon that was used by lots of different kinds of soldiers, including knights. Most likely originated from the tool version, which is used, of course, to fell trees and other things, and chop wood in general. But I think it didn't take mankind too long to associate the idea of, if I can chop wood, I can chop his arm. The idea of optimizing the design of an axe in order to throw it effectively also was excogitated both in Europe but also in America. I mean, if you think about the tomahawk, for example, which could be used for that and for hand-to-hand combat, of course. Although there were several different kinds, one of the most famous one is the Francisca, the throwing axe used by the Franks, possibly in the 3rd century AD. Historians among you will be familiar with this, and Age of Empires fans. Interesting how those two things overlap a lot. Number 8, throwing knives. Okay, so similar situation, a throwing knife is a knife which has been optimized in its design for throwing rather than for hand-to-hand combat, but they are a distinct category from ordinary knives. Now, these are found in basically all cultures. Very famous are some of the Japanese types. Now, I've seen some pros throwing knives, and when you train for it, you can become extremely precise. A throwing knife, when compared to a regular knife, well, one of the main differences is the fact that usually they're made of one single piece of steel and they don't have handles. Also, the balance of the weapon will be different. Of course, different geometric shapes will perform differently in relation to the center of gravity and technique involved. Throwing a knife at an enemy could catch him by surprise. The weapon would be very fast and therefore very difficult to block, parry or dodge. Number 7, hungamunga. So we're back with an African weapon, and I'm not sure if I pronounced it right, but it has so many names anyways, depending on what tribe and what part of Africa. This big, nasty, in between an axe and a knife they don't want to be hit by. This weapon is fascinating because I think it does have some advantages over both an axe and a knife, in the sense that you need to kind of hope that it lands or hits with the blade apart or with the point. Now, this weapon kind of increases your chances of hurting because it has a lot of areas that present a danger to the opponent. Now, of course, I've never handled one. I don't know how difficult it is to throw, but we do have to admit that it is scary looking. Number 6, the sling. Now, the sling is a very ancient and simple design. And I'm talking about the ancient weapon, of course, not the modern so-called catapult or slingshot. Out of all the weapons we've looked so far, the sling is the first weapon that uses projectiles. Therefore, it is not the weapon itself that is thrown, but it is the missile or the projectile that will deal the damage and impact the opponent. Now, of course, that is preferable because it allows you to reuse the weapon multiple times. And also, arguably, that's preferable because if you throw a knife and you miss the target, people can throw it back at you. But if you throw a rock using a sling, even if you miss the target, although they can throw it back at you, they won't be able to do it as effectively if they don't have a sling. Number 5, PLUMBATA. So here is an ancient Roman weapon that I think is brilliant in its design. It's basically a lead-weighted dart, and it was carried and used by infantrymen and thrown at their enemy before engaging in hand-to-hand combat. Ancient sources vary, but generally speaking we have an idea that soldiers at some point would even carry up to 5 of these. It is bigger than the arrow used with a bow, but it is fledged, and the difference is again the fact that it does present a weight which probably helps with penetration and stability. PLUMBATA were praised in ancient sources for their effectiveness, for example in the anonymous treatise titled De Rebus Bellicis, where we also hear about spiked PLUMBATA and other possible versions. The name probably comes from the Latin word plumbum, which means lead. Number 4. PILUM. So the Roman pilum is the javelin specifically used and developed by the ancient Romans to be used by infantry, and in imperial times by heavy infantry, and to be thrown at the enemy before again engaging in hand-to-hand combat. Now there are a lot of theories on the number of pila that were carried and used. Some people say 1, some people say 2, and of course there are several possible designs. Some have a circular weight and some don't, but the general idea of course is to inflict as many wounds, damage, disruption into the enemy unit. Now if you want to see how the pilum works against people, against armor, against shield, then I strongly suggest to check out the video made by my friend Matt Easton at Schola Gladiatoria. He has been very thorough in showing how the pilum can go through shields, go through some armor, and definitely go through people. One of the things we notice is that it is more lethal than we had expected, which really marries well with the information we have of how popular they were with the Roman army. The hard pyramidal tip is optimized for penetration to inflict nasty wounds and possibly incapacitate an opponent. Number 3, repeating crossbow. The Chinese repeating crossbow called liannu is really an incredible piece of invention, probably designed during the Warring States period. Now one of the reasons why it's so high on the list is because the weapon remained in use from the Warring State period all the way up to the Qing dynasty. Now of course it has seen different developments, but the general idea was the same. Compared to European crossbows, they were weaker, significantly weaker, but the Chinese did try to compensate for that by dipping the points in very powerful poison. A drawback of the weapon, however, would be the limited range. One of the good advantages of this design is the very high rate of fire. You could in fact span the bow, place the bolt, and shoot with a one-handed movement. Number 2, European medieval crossbow. The crossbow is not exactly a medieval invention. Crossbow-like weapons existed in the classical period. But whenever we think of the Genoese crossbowmen and the effectiveness of very powerful crossbows with incredible draw weights, then the weapon we are thinking of is the medieval crossbow. So one of the main differences in design is the fact that of course the prod, the bow-like assembly, is mounted horizontally rather than vertically like it would be on a bow. Now a crossbow has both advantages and disadvantages when compared to a bow. An advantage is the fact that with a crossbow, you can keep the weapon loaded at all times, and then whenever something happens, like for example you're ambushed, you can just shoot immediately. You can't really do that with a bow. Theoretically, depending on the situation, crossbowmen could be readier to shoot than archers. But a disadvantage of the crossbow is again the rate of fire, for a lack of a better word for it. By the time a crossbowman reloads and is ready to shoot again, an archer will have shot a lot of times, and this is one of the reasons why oftentimes we see professional crossbowman units utilizing very big pavis shields for defense to protect them while they were reloading. And of course it would have been crucial to properly utilize infantry and cavalry to provide support. Now before moving to number 1, I have an honorable mention, and that's this spear. Now I know that this might sound strange. At the end of the day, this spear is a close combat weapon, but it can be thrown. And again, even though, going back to what I said at the beginning, anything can be thrown, a spear can be thrown effectively, and possibly that is the one most important single advantage of an overhead grip, or I can threaten you even if I don't throw it. Number 1, the longbow. Now here I'm really trying not to be biased, because my favorite ranged weapon is the crossbow, but I have to put the longbow higher. And one of the things is not only the incredible range, but also the rate of fire. The numbers of arrows shot into the enemy, into the French knights, for example, during the Battle of Agincourt, is astonishing. Now, the bow and arrow is really ancient. We're talking about a weapon that was probably developed in the Mesolithic period, initially as a hunting implement, but again, the step of moving into an actual weapon used against other people possibly didn't take long to happen. At the end of the day, that's what humans are like. Longbows during the medieval period would have a draw weight of in between 90 all the way up to 160 pounds. which is rather significant. That of course required a reasonable amount of strength and quite a few years of training. Also because during a battle, we're not talking about shooting the bow once, we're talking about shooting the bow as many times as possible into the enemy and as quickly as possible, and maintaining accuracy. And all of this requires a lot of muscle, training, and years. Alright, Noble Ones, well I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember thumbs up, and if you're not yet members of this community, become a Noble One. Subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. Please let me know if you agree with my list. If you don't, well, let me know what your top 3 would be, or even your top 10 if you've got the time. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.